Just to start off, like we said, want to get on the same page. Why are we doing this, and what is the moratorium? So I think if we go to the next slide, a lot of people have been familiar and curious about what is going on with these moratoriums. What do they do? And there's a lot of momentum picking up on this, which I think is shown why we have 380 people on right now. So this is a tool. It seems like there is a new wave of data center resistance, and this is a very useful tool in giving us time, giving us some more leverage. And we've seen moratoriums start to pass all over the country, from Maine, New York City, Denver, uh, Texas, Arizona. These are common strategies that are working right now to move forward our campaigns. But we want to just dive into what does this mean? Because not all moratoriums are created equally. So we can go to the next slide. So basically, a moratorium is just a temporary pause on data center approvals or permits. So it is giving us time. It is a pause. This pause can be 30 days, it can be 36 months. They range quite a bit, but there is an established set period of time or certain conditions that is pausing data center approval or permitting that gives us some time to figure this out. They are typically put in place by the jurisdiction, where depending on the organizing, this could be giving them time to do environmental studies or see the impacts to the energy grid, see the impacts to ratepayers. There are a ton of different reasons why a municipality or an entity would pass a moratorium, and that depends on your local fight and the organizing going around there. But yeah, they can be issued at many different levels. So we go to the next slide. And we just want to be clear on what moratoriums are not. So moratoriums are not a full-out ban. They are not a full-out ban on data centers, on zoning. This can set up a ban, but they are not a full ban. We want to be clear on that. So we don't want to stop the organizing at a moratorium because it does not win us our campaign yet, unless there's like very specific circumstances in your area. Um, and typically, most of these moratoriums are not stopping already approved permits or expand or facilities. So a lot of these moratoriums that we're seeing are future data centers, future zoning, but they're not retroactive and stopping already approved data centers or rezoning or land sales or whatever it is. Um, and like we said, moratoriums are not all the same. Some are much stronger than others, and we want to talk about that a little bit here in how can we make it as strong as possible? Because this issue is getting so much momentum and is being seen as a useful tool, we're also seeing some co-opting of moratoriums. There's some examples of utilities writing their own moratoriums to give them more time. So we want to talk about like what makes a strong moratorium and what makes a little bit of a weaker moratorium. So that is just some grounding on what these are and what we're going to be talking about here. And then if we go to the next slide. Cool. Yeah. So moratoriums, like we said, are a starting point for lasting protections, but they're not alone. So that is the first thing that we want people to get in. This should not be the end. It is the starting point and a way to advance your campaign. So to talk about how we can build on this, how they can use this as an organizing point and what it sets up, I'm going to pass it to Alli Finn from AI Now, who's done an incredible amount of work putting together policy and working with groups to win real material policy after these moratoriums are paused. So I'll pass it to you, Alli.
Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks everyone for being here. Next slide, please, Kate. So the rest of our conversation today is really going to focus on this question. Once the pause is in place, what can we do with it? And this really applies to all the folks here, even if you haven't passed a moratorium yet, because there are ways to set up your moratorium to be as strong as possible and angle towards these protections from day one. I want to highlight that we have a new draft resource that we're dropping in the chat right now that includes much of the technical information we will be sharing today, as well as organizing tips. It focuses on best practices for data center moratoriums, as well as policies and practices that can be put in place after the fact. We're going to be updating this with additional insights and examples from today's session, and we'll be publishing it on the North Star Data Center Policy Toolkit in a permanent version as well. And I just want to shout out that this is really a labor of deep collaboration, care, collectivity. So shout out to the Data Center Working Group, Anthropocene Alliance, Athena, the Better Data Center Project, Fair Shake, FreePress, Halt the Harm, Kairos Fellows, Local Progress, MediaJustice, North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, TechTonic Justice, so many more. This is an example of the organizing that we need to win. Next slide. This guide includes a ton of information, and I just want to highlight that we're not going to get in depth today on best practices for moratoriums, but those are in there, and a couple of them are on the slide. Next slide. So once you have a moratorium in place, next slide, please. Or perhaps if somebody else passed your moratorium and you weren't involved, we need to start by answering some key questions to know what's already there, so we can understand how to move forward. And again, if you don't have a moratorium yet, answering these questions can help you craft a stronger pause. So first, we need to understand, what does the moratorium require or establish? I encourage folks to read the actual text, not just news coverage, since it can be talked about in a bit of an imprecise way. Second is the moratorium time-bound, and or does it end when a certain condition or set of requirements is met? So our best practice here, right, is to establish a moratorium ideally for a year, but also to put in requirements such as developing and passing zoning ordinances, setting up new permitting processes, establishing local priorities, perhaps assessments and studies. But we want to know what is already in there, because we can use those processes to our advantage. And these conditions, we also want to know who's responsible for meeting them. So that's who the organizing can target and try to work with. And if these are not met, can the moratorium be extended? That may be in the moratorium, that may be an existing code. And the last key question here is, what processes, if any, are required in terms of public notice and engagement? We're seeing that a lot of moratoriums don't include required public notice. So can you create your own community-centered process? How can you get the word out if that's not something that's already required of your jurisdiction? Next slide, please. And here I just want to highlight that, like Matt said before, moratoriums differ quite widely, right? They are not all the same. And some of the ways that they differ are going to show up in these questions. So when the moratorium starts, how long it is, whether you can extend, but also what processes are paused or exempted. So most moratoriums are pausing particular permitting or approvals, but those might be in zoning board processes, land use processes. They also might be building or construction permits. They might be hookups to water or electric utilities. Shout out Ypsilanti, Michigan. They might be pauses on rezoning or comprehensive plan amendments. And it's very important to know this, because some types of permitting might not be paused by your moratorium. And to answer some questions in the chat, those types of permits can continue moving forward if they are not explicitly named. And then the last way that moratoriums differ is the types of uses, which data centers they apply to. In some cases, they apply to all data centers, but in some cases, they might define data centers in a certain way, by size, by energy capacity, over a certain square footage, only in specific zones. So again, if projects already exist or are proposed outside of the scope of the moratorium, they might be able to continue in the interim or during this pause period. Next slide, please. So second, I'm not going to get into this a lot because we have multiple incredible panelists, organizers who are going to talk about it. But really winning the next steps after a moratorium is about building people power and keeping up the momentum, and critically making sure that the second a moratorium passes, you have that next call to action ready to go. Next slide. Okay. So if this already isn't defined, what we encourage folks to do is to set goals for your community, right? What protections does your community need? And to start with the goals before you start with the technical policy. So I think about this in three ways. The first is, What do we want in terms of data centers? Do we want no new data centers, only specific types or sizes of data centers, or only data centers and facilities if maybe they fit certain requirements like water and energy use or other environmental standards? Because the answer to this question is going to determine which policy intervention we move forward with. We also encourage folks to think about what else is critical to your community. As we know, data centers have a laundry list of impacts, and there's multiple ways to address these. We encourage communities to prioritize what is going to be most impactful to folks not only living next door, but throughout the community who might be impacted by this build out. And then critically, this really isn't a last question. This should be a first question. Who is most impacted and making sure that they are involved in the decision-making processes, not in a performative, symbolic way, but in a meaningful way. Next slide. Once we have the goals defined, then you can get to the possible policy interventions. And this is really what are the durable protections and demands that are going to permanently protect your community. So what I'm offering here is just one way to think about this, one strategy, but in the resource, in the policy toolkit online, there are so many different ways to stop a data center, and there's so many different possible policy interventions to pursue. But one way to think about it for the local level is this. If you have the authority in your jurisdiction, if you're not preempted, meaning your state doesn't prevent you from doing so, pass a ban or a prohibition on data centers. If you don't want that, or if an explicit ban isn't possible, what we're seeing as successful is localities defining and restricting data centers tightly. That means including or updating the definition of what a data center is, and then effectively restricting them or prohibiting them in certain ways. So that can be prohibiting data centers over a certain size, 20 megawatts, 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts, in terms of energy capacity. It can be in or near specific zones, right? Prince William County prohibits data centers in agricultural districts. It can be by square footage. A note of caution here is that we don't recommend only restricting data centers or prohibiting them by square footage, since the technology can change over time and they may be able to fit more powerful hardware, chips, servers, et cetera, in less physical space as the technology develops. But we do see some exciting models restricting data centers by both physical square footage as well as resource use in terms of energy capacity or megawatts. I'll highlight Nashville, Tennessee, which just passed a new zoning ordinance prohibiting data centers over 100 megawatts, but then defining different types of data centers between 5 and 100 megawatts and having different sets of requirements, including different types of permitting needed for each category. Alternatively, or in addition to these restrictions, one thing that we see working really well is permitting and zoning reform. And there's strong permitting and zoning reform, and there's less strong zoning and permitting reform. What we see working really well are updating conditional use permits or special use permits, which allow the local government or the zoning board or the community to require that data center developers meet a really robust set of standards in order to move in, and put the onus on proving them on the developer rather than the community. There's a lot of other approaches here: setback requirements, how far data centers are from transit hubs, schools, housing, et cetera, noise ordinances. But what all of these rely on to be successful is transparency, that's regular reporting and monitoring, and then enforcement mechanisms. So we aren't just fining one of the wealthiest companies in the world $1,000 a day if they violate our policies, but actually holding them to account. And these are detailed with a lot more examples in the North Star Data Center Policy Toolkit. Next slide, please. This is the last point I'll make here, and then I'll turn it back to Matt to introduce our local organizers and advocates. What we're starting to see people do across the country is to think beyond data centers as physical infrastructure, but understand what they power and the other impacts that they might have on our communities. And this falls in two buckets. The first is, we're seeing at the local and state level protections being passed to protect communities from harms driven by the deployment of AI technologies. So that might look like restricting local government use of harmful AI technologies, such as in public benefits and healthcare and other types of decision making. Shout out TechTonic Justice for their great work here. prohibiting or limiting the use of surveillance technologies, including surveillance pricing, algorithmic wage discrimination. Challenging corporate behavior through meaningful penalties, and community oversight as a counterweight to corporate control. And again, the guide that we're dropping in the chat has a lot more detail here. And then the second and last point is also to realize that data centers is just one example of how corporations are making decisions about our futures, right? Instead of people living in communities who get to live what happens next. So we have a suite of recommendations designed to limit corporate influence over the processes and institutions involved in data center development. That includes things like banning NDAs or non-disclosure agreements, regulating public utility commissions, which control our grid, our electricity, our water, et cetera, to ensure meaningful public participation, curbing corporate influence in elections, addressing the whole AI stack, that's the supply chain of AI, and then really empowering what we've seen happen in Tucson, in upstate New York, and Minneapolis, and other places, calls for public power, taking back our utilities from private companies, and of course, making sure that economic development promises are not going to corporations, but actually to communities in banning subsidies. So this is like hours and hours, right, of policies that we could discuss crammed into one slide. But again, we just want to encourage folks to think expansively and beyond the infrastructure itself. I'm going to pass back to Matt here so we can hear from folks who've been doing this on the ground.